Before I begin my talk today, I want to thank a few people. First, we owe a debt of gratitude to my predecessor, David Robel, who guided our organization through the first year of COVID with strength and grace. Thank you, David. Second, I can't possibly heap enough praise on our executive director, Elaine Nelson. You all know what an extraordinary person she is, managing all of us and our needs, but you only know the half of it. This past year, I've had a window onto her incredible skill at leading the Western History Association. The fact that we're still in business, thriving, and holding a conference is a testament to her grit and her determination. Thank you, Elaine. And finally, I want to acknowledge Howard Lamar, an extraordinary mentor to all of us in this association. About 35 years ago, he took a chance on me when he took me in as a graduate student. I'm forever grateful to Howard for introducing me to the academic study of the American West. This is for Howard. Am I Chinese? This thought has crossed my mind numerous times since I began living in China in 2015. It occurs to me when I sit in a park watching the Ayis or the aunties gather in groups to visit, who remind me of my grandmother and her sisters, who were inseparable in their old age. The thought occurs to me when I visit with Chinese friends and their extended families, and I'm welcomed into their homes in the same way my own massive extended family takes in all friends as if they're part of Nuestra Familia. This recognition overwhelmed me one day as I sat eating lunch in Baidi, Tibet. We had just crossed over 17,000-foot mountain path and had stopped to have lunch. Baidi, with its architecture, its altitude and vibe, could have been my parents' hometown of Antonito, Colorado, except that the roads in Antonito are paved. Baidi shepherds, herding yak, not sheep, wearing Levi's and cowboy hats, drove beat-up trucks, parked, and came into the cafe for lunch and to socialize, just like workers at Dos Hermanos or the Dutch Mill in Antonito. The waitress sat us in a corner by ourselves and brought us tea while we sat and took in the scene. She eventually brought us our lunch, warm flatbread, which looked like a tortilla to me, and a brothy stew that had tiny pieces of lamb or yak and potatoes cooked to perfection. It was a meal I'd eaten at my grandmother's kitchen table a dozen times. Now, granted, I was practically hypoxic, but sitting in that cinder block room, watching the men gather to talk, drink tea, and smoke cigarettes brought me a kind of calm and knowingness I've only felt a few times in my life. I was literally on the other side of the world, in a place where I could not speak the language, and yet I felt at home. People warmly glanced over at the foreigner who did not look that foreign. I begun to think of China as a home away from home. But how could a woman of Mexican Hispano descent, with long family roots embedded in the borderlands of Mexico and the United States, and the San Luis Valley of Colorado in particular, have any meaningful connection to China? I was in the most foreign of places, both physically and intellectually, but there were no obvious touchstones to explain my feelings. But then I read Rudolfo Anaya's little-known work, A Chicano in China. And I found someone else who shared similar feelings and observations about China, albeit 35 years earlier. Anaya, who passed away last year, was one of the founders of Chicano literature. His work influenced a generation of writers, historians, and folklorists who have written about New Mexico and the American Southwest as a Hispano homeland. In 2019, I went to visit Professor Anaya at his home on the West Mesa of Albuquerque, taking an offering of my mother's bizcochitos to him. He gave me a few hours of his time as I babbled on about all I'd seen in China, the familiarity that emanated from such a foreign place. And it was truly one of the most meaningful experiences of my academic life. And that Sunday morning visit has given me much to consider about the relationship between Asia, Chicanos, and the American West. Since my visit with Anaya, I've come to realize that perhaps I should not have been so unmoored by my sense of connection. My genetic story tells me that about 35% of my mitochondrial DNA comes from Asia, specifically the B2 haplogroup. As you can see from the figure, my ancestors migrated out of Africa, across the Arabian Peninsula, and then east into Central Asia, and not west into Europe. They moved across Asia and into Siberia, before my maternal ancestors eventually crossed Beringia, roughly 12,000 years before present, or BP. Here, in what we think of today as the American West, my maternal ancestors made a home, they raised families, and built a community in one of the last places on Earth that humans settled. Eventually they met up with, in both domestic and violent ways, the group of my other ancestors who had taken a left instead of a right on the Anatolian plateau and ended up in Spain and Portugal before heading to the Americas in the 16th century. In what is today the American West, they finally reunited with each other after 50,000 years of separation and created a long line of wandering families who made homes in a place they thought of as their homeland. In this story, the American West is the final meeting place for travelers ending migrations that lasted millennia. This West is not a borderland. It's not a frontier. It is the place of humanity's reunion. It is the home for the last wanderers of the human race. The archaeological and paleontological record of North America supports my story of my DNA tells. The fields of anthropology, archaeology, and paleontology in North America face an intellectual tsunami of new discoveries, battles over replicability and authenticity, and new technologies such as genomics. Nevertheless, there are a few basic facts that scientists agree upon. People from Asia arrived in North America between 12,000 to 23,000 years ago. Some of these people emigrated from eastern Siberia via Beringia, which was then above sea level as a result of the massive ice caps pulling and holding water from the Earth's ocean. Some of these migrants walked across the resulting land bridge and then followed a break in two major ice sheets, eventually making their way onto the Great Plains of North America and spreading south and east. Others probably crossed the land bridge even earlier, and upon encountering the massive ice glaciers, adapted and made watercraft that took them south along the Kelp Highway that ran along the Pacific coast from present-day Alaska to California, Mexico, and as far south as the tip of South America. So why does this genomic and archaeological story nonetheless seem unfamiliar to me and my family? Because it's been erased from the written record of census reports and parish records, which in contrast to mitochondrial DNA are almost essentially and entirely patrilineal. Archives only tell us the story of the most recent past and fail to capture our longer history embedded in deeper time. My family tree shows only Iberian names, Suazos, Roybals, Sedanos, and Montoyas, all from the male side of the family. And a deep dive into Ancestry.com reveals few signs of Native American or Asian origins. But of course, settler colonialism was premised upon erasing matrilineal connections in official records on which claims to property and inheritance could be based. So part of my effort here is to put that matrilineal longue durée story back into my family narrative. These genetic revelations have caused a bit of upheaval among some in my family, who have always told a very different and less unsettling narrative about our family's origins. These stories, based on Iberian ambitions and genealogy, have fostered a deep sense of our always belonging in southern Colorado and northern New Mexico. People in my parents' generation and before have always insisted that they are Spanish or Hispano. Like many of their neighbors, they can trace their family back to the entrada of Juan de Oñate in 1598. These family genealogists weave a narrative about how our family migrated from Spain directly to Santa Fe and then to the small towns of Abiquiu, La Madera, La Pateca, and Guadalupita in northern New Mexico. From those bases, they then made the final leap farther north into the San Luis Valley to be shepherds. My family fostered close ties with other people just like them, rarely venturing out into regions to socialize, much less marry, into various indigenous communities that surrounded them, the Pueblo, the Jicarilla, or the Ute. People, both individuals and nation-states, use genealogy to build the family tree they want to admire, while conveniently ignoring the branches that do not fit that narrative. My family focuses on the story that comes from the East and from Europe, and specifically from Spain. My family's sense of identity revolves entirely around movement from south to north, from Santa Fe to the San Luis Valley, or from the Iberian East to the North American West. We like to say that we did not cross any border. The border crossed us. There's nothing in my family's narrative about any Native American genetic inheritance, much less an Asiatic genetic inheritance, that crossed the Pacific. In this talk, however, I want to focus on the narrative that, as Anaya noted, quote, did not originate in Spain. This shift in the narrative makes my family uncomfortable because it focuses on earlier migrations rather than on home and on settlement. What follows if we think about the migration of Asiatic peoples, broadly speaking, across Beringia as a starting point for thinking about the place of migrants into the American West? Or more precisely, what happens when we incorporate the history that happened long before European arrival and incorporate that into our national narrative? The mobility of humans around the Pacific Rim is not something that started with the gold rush and the advent of steamship technology. Rather, it began thousands of years ago when people moved north and eastward, off the Tibetan Plateau and the high plains of Sichuan, into Siberia, across Beringia, and into North America. It was a migration that profoundly affected what would become our American West, and it is a migration that can help us rethink all of our places in that West. In the same way that my family wants to create a particular narrative about themselves, so do we as historians of the American West and the United States ignore a major part of our migratory past. For example, most U.S. history textbooks begin with the migration of Europeans and perhaps a brief mention of indigenous peoples who were here before that migration. The College Board, which administers the Advanced Placement AP exam in U.S. history over the years, has almost eliminated all questions and therefore coverage of pre-Columbian peoples in North America. The starting date of the AP course, 1491, itself suggests a very static conception, a mere snapshot of Native Americans before European migration, signaling that very little of consequence happened prior to the arrival of Europeans. Our textbooks still privilege this migration from Europe to the Americas and from east to west. That incomplete narrative has negatively impacted our national political and cultural discourse. The long American tradition from the Know-Nothings, to the various iterations of the Ku Klux Klan, to the American Firsters, both in the 1920s and today, use nativism as the way to privilege themselves as the true Americans, the ones who belong. Migrants aren't welcome. We all want to be settled in a place that is uniquely and exclusively ours. The American West, one of the last places on earth into which humans moved, explodes at ideas, because everyone in the American West, from the Pueblo Indian to the Hispano shepherd to the Anglophone suburbanite, ultimately migrated from someplace else, much more recently, than people almost anywhere else on the globe. We need to get comfortable with the very uncomfortable idea that we're all relatively recent migrants to this place we call the West. Now, my point is not to challenge claims to indigeneity. Actually, it's quite the opposite. In order to understand the competing claims that people make to Western lands and resources, we need to embrace the concept of deep time and deep history in order to appreciate how long-standing is the presence of indigenous peoples in this place. The story of America does not begin in 1776, nor in 1492, but rather in 12,000 BP at the very least, when the first migrants stepped into this place. If we push the moment of the beginning of America back to its actual start date, then we create a narrative that highlights the long history of Native American lives, communities, and nations on this landscape. My experience in Shanghai and China has taught me that such migrations and invasions are not merely forgotten, but they're repressed. Studying the American West had already made me attuned to rethinking how we teach U.S. history. And living in China has only reinforced my belief that we need to de-emphasize the New England colonial experience, as well as the migration from the East to the West. In our textbook, Global Americans, we embrace the idea that Americans can come from everywhere in the world and make a home and a community in our nation. But these global Americans, if you will, have been erased from our memory. Perhaps that erasure is provoked by how unsettling it is to think about that one comes from somewhere else. So in my talk today, I want to look at two examples of this repression. First, the Chinese effort to deny their African origins with the idea of Peking Man as a symbol of unique Chinese origins. And second, I want to look at Rudolfo Anaya's efforts through his works to unite Chinese and Chicanos into La Raza, a united front of brown people against white imperialism, an effort that repressed Chinese conquest of nomadic peoples in the semi-arid west of Asia. I will conclude with what I think is Anaya's more important contribution to helping us sort out our place in the American West. The golden carp from his classic novel, Bless Me Ultima, provides a symbol that speaks to people across different cultures, Chinese, indigenous, Hispano, and Anglo, about the power of water, family, religion, and nature. And by returning to the metaphorical influence of the golden carp, we can look at our shared relationship to water and land resources that are becoming diminished and polluted. Now, Americans are not the only ones who cling to their identity as more native than the last group who arrived. Living in China, watching another people and a nation-state lay claim to original possession of their land has given me insight into the analogous attitude here in the United States. Chinese have their own prejudices against migrants. Those prejudices are evident in immigration restrictions that keep most foreigners, even laborers, at bay. In a country of over 1.4 billion people, there are only a little over 800,000 foreign residents, or less than 1% of the entire population. By comparison, Denver alone has a population of almost 3 million people, of whom 350,000, or 12%, are foreign-born. So Denverites encounter foreigners much more often than do Shanghaiese. The Chinese government also has stringent migration restrictions for their own citizens who wish to move between rural and urban places. Chinese citizens who do not hold hukou, or the Chinese household registration, in a particular city cannot receive services such as health care, schooling, and access to housing in that city to where they are migrating. The result is an internal migration of upwards of 300 million people annually who leave to find work, and then need to leave their children behind with grandparents in order for them to use those services that are allocated to them in their hometowns. Furthermore, Chinese society fetishes whiteness and being Han Chinese as opposed to one of the 56 legally recognized non-Han ethnic groups, Uyghurs, Hui, Tibetans, Miao, and Hakka, just to name a few. One just needs to see the subway ads for skin whiteners rolling by on electric billboards to understand the depth of their need to express their whiteness, which may be more about labor than about race. In the post-Mao period, one of the most public examples of this nationalism arose over the origins of Peking Men, who had been discovered in a cave near Beijing in the 1920s. According to this popular and at one point officially held government position, the discovery of Peking Man, who appeared at the same time to be very different from earlier discoveries, proved that humanity originated in Asia as well as in Africa. The implication was that China held a claim to being the cradle of humanity equal to that of Africa. The darker corollary was that different races of humans did not share a common origin and might even be regarded as separate species. And if you accept the notion that Peking Man as a unique and original line of human evolution, then you might also believe that we're not all connected by our common African origins, but instead come from distinct racial backgrounds that developed at different times or different rates. Once you accept a theory based on Peking Man that civilizations have multiple separate origins, then the next natural step is to rank those civilizations. Now, Chinese nationalists during the 20th century used this theory to boost China's place on the global stage. And in the wake of Tiananmen Square in 1989 and international pressure and a sense of needing to provide a nationalist coherence as China mounted its international rise, the Chinese government pushed this Peking Man line, funded internal research to support the theory, and staved off all interference from UNESCO and international scientists. That Chinese government-held position has officially softened, and UNESCO now controls the archaeological site where Peking Man was found. And Chinese academics who collaborate with their Western counterparts no longer adhere to the idea that Peking Man is the origin of the Han Chinese people. But the uniqueness of Peking Man lives on in Chinese lay opinion. On Baidu, one of the most used search engines in China, the question, "Is Peking Man the ancestor of the Chinese people?" is still a very popular search query. And while academics and government officials no longer embrace the Peking Man theory, many Han Chinese still find it an important tenet of their family identity. And just as my family and the New Mexico Genealogical Society want to find identity in their European Iberian roots, the Chinese also want to find their origin story in Peking Man. They find it compelling and comforting, even in the face of scientific evidence. Now, debates about origins and migrations play a role as well in Chinese Western expansion and control of its minority peoples. For example, Uyghur scholars claim that Xinjiang was settled by multiple peoples from various ethnicities in East Central Asia, making homes and practicing Islam long before the Manchu-led Qing dynasty annexed Xinjiang in the mid-18th century. But on the other hand, Chinese scholars sympathetic to the Chinese Communist Party's efforts to assimilate the Uyghurs, they instead claim that Uyghurs and Han are just two groups that share the same genetic origins and have been united since 200 BC, when the Han Dynasty incorporated what is today Xinjiang into the Chinese Empire. In this national narrative, the Uyghurs were always a part of Greater China, no matter which dynasty was governing. But they succumbed to the temptations, that is, the Uyghurs succumbed to the temptations of the Western Chinese frontier, and they were forced by foreign invaders to embrace Islam. Therefore, according to the CCP and its historians, Uyghurs in the national interest need to be re-educated into being good Chinese and incorporate themselves back into the body politic of the nation. Now, such claims carry tidbits of truth layered in falsehood and elision. These nationalist anthropological and paleontological assertions have the rhetorical political power to bring people together against other people. Seeing how that rhetoric is deployed in a context that is so different from my own personal circumstances and home country highlights the destructive power of how history and science can be deployed to advance nationalist, racist, and ethnic agendas, both abroad and at home. Chinese struggles with the unsettling fact of migration have been highlighted for me as I have fostered a collaboration between NYU Shanghai and Paul Salopek and the Out of Eden Project. Salopek is a two-time Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and a National Geographic explorer, and has been walking since 2013, when he left Ethiopia. His walk will end sometime in 2027, when he finally makes it to the tip of South America. By the time he has completed his journey, he will have walked through 31 countries and met thousands of people along the way. Using the technique of slow journalism, Paul and his team of educators ask us to take a break from the digital age and to slow down to a walking pace to find the commonality among humans and their communities despite differences of ethnicity, religion, urbanity, and gender. After an 18-month hiatus at the western border of China with Myanmar due to COVID, civil war, and Chinese bureaucracy, Paul has now entered China, and he resumed walking last month in September. I take it as a positive sign that the Chinese government continues to move away from their position on Peking Men by welcoming Paul's walk and welcoming Paul into China, along with the implications for the common origins and migratory nature of all humanity. Now, Paul's trek across the globe is important to me because it bridges my love of both China and the American West, and it puts these regions' histories into a conversation. He is literally the walking embodiment of these connections that I find so illuminating and engaging. And sometime in 2023, Paul will take a boat ride across the Bering Strait and enter Alaska and the American West. Paul is taking the walk my maternal ancestors took thousands of years ago. But Paul's walk is really only half the human story. The great human migration is not unidirectional, so it can't be retraced in a straight line by just one man's journey. Instead, human migration is a reunion of different migrations, departing from a single African origin, that at many junctures moved in opposite directions. Paul's walk retraces the path of my matrilineal ancestors, but he necessarily ignores my Iberian ancestors, who turned west at the Anatolian Peninsula and headed for what is today Europe, before eventually crossing the Atlantic Ocean and into the Americas. Why Paul and the Out of Eden Project chose to focus on the migration through Asia rather than Europe, I cannot know for sure, but I do understand why I and other Latinos want to downplay the Atlantic crossing of my Iberian ancestors who inflicted the violence of colonialism. Westward European expansion seems fundamentally more invasive, exploitative, and therefore more unsettling than Paul's peaceful eastward trek out of Eden through Asia and then on into the Americas. There is, however, a repression of memory in this juxtaposition of Pacific prehistoric diffusion across Beringia with the violent and historically recorded European conquest. Imagining the prehistoric migrants were one big, united, happy family taking a multi-millennial stroll across the globe is an act of myth-making. For all we know, they were a quarrelsome lot, some of whom pushed others out of the way in order to get where they wanted to go. But they entered into a new world, but we cannot know what or who pulled or pushed them in or out of Asia. Did they merely follow big game, or were they pushed out by human rivals from a crowded old world? There's no way yet to tell definitively from the archaeological, genomic, or linguistic record which story is true. Whatever the reality of that prehistoric migration, it's been difficult to resist the power of our myth, in which we substitute a Pacific Eden with potentially violent Asian Old World inhabitants who pushed those people out into Beringia. Even Anaya in A Chicano in China fell into this trap. Anaya claimed that he was, quote, the first Chicano in China. And while he acknowledged that Mexican-American servicemen may have been in China during the latter days of World War II, he pointedly asserted that he was the first Mexican-American who identified as a Chicano to visit there. That distinction was important, as he took a very particular view of himself as a, quote, third world citizen, visiting his compadres in China. Anaya imagined that his trip was a symbol of brown peoples, la raza, coming together to stand against white European racism and imperialism. Anaya was caught up with his own ideas at the time of Chicanos as New World men. He saw himself as returning to the home of his ancestors, and I quote, I rushed to embrace the Chinese, he said. Brown brothers, raza. Can you imagine 1 billion new souls for la raza? We could rule the world. The gendered language that Anaya uses is no accident. He formulates his New World man as the product of an Iberian father and an indigenous mother, where the man is the conquistador and the woman is the passive vassal of man's seed. But his formulation represses the violence of conquest and instead replaces it with a myth of voluntary sexual commingling that creates these New World men, who are free to embrace both their Iberian and their indigenous heritage. A Chicano in China is framed by Anaya's own anxiety about his own Iberian origins and his desire for a new origin story devoid of European conquest. And as Anaya put it, he went to China seeking, quote, the origin that does not belong to Spain. In this reimagined past, China is reduced to a racially and culturally homogeneous mass that provides Chicanos with a non-European pedigree. Rather than a continent full of often mutually hostile warring groups, in China, Anaya finds that he would, quote, be a wanderer in a country that was a birthplace of the Asiatic people who thousands of years ago wandered across the Bering Strait into the Americas. These Chinese brown brothers, if you will, supplied his imagination and Diego Rivera's, as you can see in this image a decade earlier, with an ancient past to give dignity and spiritual depth to Chicanos and Mexicanos who might otherwise depend on Iberian conquistadors for their culture as well as for their surnames. Now, contrasting a unified Asiatic people with Iberian imperialists, however, led Anaya to fundamentally misinterpret China, which, after all, had its own violent westward expansion that belied any imagined Asiatic unity. In the 18th century, Han Chinese, under the Manchu-led Qing dynasty, invaded and conquered the semi-arid Xinjiang Plateau in the west, inhabited by nomadic Turkic-speaking Muslims. The brutality of this conquest matched the later war waged against Native Americans by European intruders. Both of these conquests involved genocidal massacres, forced relocations, and settler colonialism that dreamt of replacing indigenous populations with outsiders. Whether Han in the case of China or Europeans in the case of North America, Uyghur, Hui, and other nomadic Turkic-speaking peoples resisted Han colonialism with the same ferocity that Comanches and Lakota fended off European and American intrusions. China's brown brothers, with whom Anaya imagined so much affinity, were more like Cain and Abel than the Edenic unified past he imagined. Anaya's erasure of invasive migration in Asia went beyond forgetting about the Han Chinese westward invasion into Central Asia. Anaya also ignored that narrative of how the indigenous nomads, whom the Han eventually conquered, were empire builders themselves. The Mongols, mounted archers from the north, conquered the urbanized Chinese empire and founded the Yuan dynasty in the 13th century. The Manchus, another foreign people, invaded and conquered China again in the 17th century, and it was the Manchu-led Qing dynasty, as I mentioned earlier, that invaded Xinjiang. Chinese imperialism turned out to be a complex battle among nomadic and urbanized people. Anaya's misconception of brown peoples or indigenous peoples as passive and conquerable hides an important truth. These peoples were active agents on the move, as migratory and invasive as their eventual conquerors. The Manchu, the Mongols, Comanche, and Iroquois were all empire builders themselves, exacting tribute from the Chinese and the Europeans, respectively. So why did Anaya ignore the cultural and racial diversity of China? He had personal reasons for not looking too deeply into Chinese history. The reimagination of China as the unified cultural origin of the New World man reflected Anaya's own feelings about his politically fraught position in the waning days of the Chicano movement. Urban Marxist Chicanos had questioned Anaya's leftist credentials, seeing Anaya's celebration of rural Hispano culture as an insufficiently radical rejection of colonialism and white domination. Anaya bitterly recollected his Marxist and leftist attackers as, quote, the gang of four Chicanos, the Marxist critics who spoke out against me and others like me. He explicitly linked the 1970s American left to the 1970s cultural revolutionaries purged by Deng. By invoking an idyllic pre-communist China past, Anaya could simultaneously give his rural Hispano homeland a non-European pedigree and raise a radical fist for the Third World unity of La Raza. But the mythic past rested on historical erasure and the violence-ridden invasions and migrations that are so central to understanding Chinese history. As I reflect some 40 years later, Anaya's attempt to connect himself to Chinese peoples on some common level as third world peoples is understandable, given the political and intellectual currents surrounding him at the time. In China, Anaya saw a counterpoint to the idea of Aztlan, the supposed northern homeland of the Aztecs. Chicanos saw Aztlan as their homeland in the American Southwest and a way to claim indigeneity. Aztlan, in other words, was an origin story that solidified Chicano sovereignty over the American Southwest. Anaya's China of brown brothers moved Aztlan even further north and east to Siberia as a way to solidify the sovereignty of La Raza over the world. Both were myths that replaced the reality of constant migrations and resulting conflicts. So for Anaya, the trip to China was about finding a commonality between Chicanos in the United States and what he perceived to be his brethren among the New World men of Asia. However, Chinese can no more be lumped into one homogeneous group any more than Americans or even Latinx peoples can be. We're all a part of a diverse web of humans with complex interactions. And so I find Anaya's gestures towards the universality of man and La Raza to be gendered, inaccurate, and anchored in a very particular political moment, and so not that helpful to me about thinking about the relationship between China, Chicanos, and the American West. Rather, the real insight of Anaya's work is the power of symbol, and particularly his symbolic use of the golden carp. Now, Anaya layered symbols into all of his writings, the owl, the river, the tortuga, as a path into understanding our past. And he wrote, quote, for some time I've been seeking those simple secrets that hint at the deeper spiritual and humanistic relationships the pre-Columbian societies had with the earth and with the deities of their cosmos. Here, in his deployment of symbols, Anaya is much more successful in finding the connection between the past and the present, and the meaningful connections between humans regardless of history, migration, or place. Anaya understood that unlike science or history, symbols are much more difficult to interpret, but they may in the end provide more insight into our emotional need to find a home. In Anaya's golden carp, we find a unifying power and sacredness about the place of water in an arid landscape, whether in the American West or in Western China. Anaya understood that making a home in an unforgiving arid landscape is a shared experience. So readers first encounter the golden carp in Anaya's most renowned and beloved piece of writing, Bless Me Ultima, which is a story about the profundity of the local while gazing out to the world beyond home that beckons us to explore it. It tells the coming-of-age story of Antonio Mares, a sensitive and thoughtful boy who grew up on the llano of New Mexico's high plains. He comes from a family of farmers on his mother's side, the Lunas, meaning moon, and a family of vaqueros or ranchers on his father's side, the Marises, or which means sea. The two sides, as embodied in the relationship between his parents, is a constant struggle and accommodation between the symbolic power of the moon and the sea, the farmer and the cowboy, the local and the unknown, as the Mares family works to make a life for themselves in the harsh environment and tight economic times of the Great Depression. Antonio's father is always restless. He's a wanderer who wistfully recalls his life as a vaquero on the Llano Estacado, where he roamed freely with his compadres. Antonio's mother, on the other hand, represents home and stability and persistently resists the father's relentless desire to wander off to California. Through their relationship, Anaya highlights the tension between migrating to a potentially better place and the desire to make a home in the place of your ancestors. Through Antonio's experience, Anaya tells us that self-knowledge and growing up occur when you can finally put these tensions into balance with one another. The most intense influence on Antonio's young life is Ultima, who moves in with his family in order to live out her last days in the comfortable society of the Mares home and their community in Guadalupe. Through her, Antonio learns how to balance these tensions. Ultima is a curandera and was likely the only medical care that many of these families had. Not only does she help birth babies, heal the physically ill, and help los viejos pass on to the next world, she also heals those who are spiritually ill. But she also punishes through her magic those who she knows harbor evil. And when she arrives at the Mares household, she brings with her an owl, a trunk full of magical treasures, and a wisdom that will guide Antonio and us for the rest of our lives. Bless Me Ultima can be read merely as a charming coming-of-age story. However, it should also be read as an essay on community building in an inhospitable landscape. Anaya's landscape presents the harsh reality that families faced in the mid-20th century as they attempted to eke out a living on the arid plains or in the skimpy sliver of watered valleys that ribbon through the state of New Mexico. In fact, the book's captivating images and ideas center around the imagery of water, its scarcity, its power as a metaphorical tool for insights into the meaning of life, and its essential quality as a basis for all life in the region. So control of water is a theme that runs through almost all of Anaya's works. For me, it is the shared experience of water in an arid landscape that ties together my own study of both the American West and China. When Anaya visited the Dujiang waterworks, which are really impressive in Chengdu, he noticed that they were built by the great Li Bing almost 200 years before Jesus lived, and they transformed that Chinese economy, culture, and landscape. And just to give you a sense of what these waterworks look like, this is the waterworks system at Dujiang. And this is a little map, and you can see up at number 2 where the water is diverted, either to the right, down number 5, or down the main river to the left. And water's only moved into the smaller system when it's absolutely needed for it to be flowed. And this is an incredible architectural piece of hydrology that was done thousands of years ago. And so this story of Li Bing and the Dujiang are a major part of China's own myth-making about itself as a nation that conquers territory and aridity in order to create a great empire. And that water diversion project at Dujiang watered the plains of Sichuan, making it China's breadbasket for centuries. And so, like Anaya, having grown up in a community that revered a Sekya community, culture, the massive irrigation system in China, clearly resonated deeply both with Anaya and myself. Now, while Ultima's owl and the river and water drive the metaphorical language of the book, it is the golden carp, the most mystical and powerful of all the allusions in the book, that ties New Mexico explicitly to China. Now, Anaya sought to draw the long history associated with the carp in Chinese mythology and cosmology. To the Chinese, the carp is a symbol of hard work and success. It is the carp with its long whiskers symbolizing mystic powers who swims upstream to complete its life cycle. The carp's persistence is rewarded by its ability to perpetuate a long family line, which is the heart of Chinese culture. Now, the golden carp in Bless Me Ultima lives in the river, but is only visible to a few people in Guadalupe, such as Antonio's more thoughtful friends, and a few adults, including Ultima. Anaya implies that only those who are religiously inclined, and it could be Catholic or native or naturalist religion, can see the golden carp in all of its magnificent glory among the plain brown carp among which it swims. It is the symbol that ties the Hispanionist embodied in Bless Me Ultima with Anaya's fascination with China and Asia. The meaning of the golden carp in Bless Me Ultima plays a dual role. On one hand, it can be seen as a Christ-like figure sent to live among and save the people from their sins. On the other, the golden carp can be interpreted as some idealized form of nature sent to warn us about the abuse of land and our water resources. Whether Christian or secular, the golden carp is ultimately a symbol that allows us to speculate beyond the particulars of our own experiences. Contemplating the meaning of the golden carp allows me, in particular, to see the connection with the shepherds in Baidi, which I talked about at the beginning of my talk, or with my Chinese friends' commitment to their own families and place and their home. In 1986, as Anaya wrote A Chicano in China, he explicitly made the connection using the golden carp between Asia and his Chicano homeland that he illuminated more fully in Bless Me Ultima. And he said, quote, Asia, it's the land of the golden carp. Asia's the land of beginning. It's the Sipapu, the beginning of the Americas. It's a timeless land. I return to find myself. I go in search of clues, a fish, an owl, a door. I will look at signs, I will listen. I will return full of the secrets, the dream, the memory that we call history. Now, Anaya's golden carp is special not only because of its ornamentation, but also because it faces the daunting task of trying to lead and save a sinful people who err against both their neighbors and against nature. Anaya finished his tour through China with a final stop in Hangzhou, which is a gorgeous city built around West Lake, just about an hour south of Shanghai. And it's a city in which Marco Polo claimed to have seen on his travels through China. Although Hangzhou is a city of over 10 million people today, its reputation is as a resort city that revolves around the lake and the rolling hills around that lake that give off the waft of fresh Longjing or dragonwheel tea as the wind blows down them across the lake and into the heart of the ancient city. I can attest that it is a magical place. Now, when Anaya toured Westlake, he encountered a massive golden carp, and his companions who were with him and who had recently read Bless Me Ultima smiled at him knowingly as he became overwhelmed by the number of carp and their glistening beauty. Anaya wrote of that moment, long ago, as a small boy, growing up in Santa Rosa, I saw these golden carp. I wrote the legend of the people who were turned into golden carp and the God who came to live with them. My story, my legend moves into China and stirs the water. Thousands of years ago, China sent part of her memory to the Americas, a memory that may sleep for thousands of years, but it will awaken. For Anaya, the golden carp was the link between the narratives he told about his people in Santa Rosa and the Llano, and the connections he imagined with his ancestors who had come across Beringia from Asia and settled in what is today the American Southwest. During these last few months while writing this talk, I've spent time reading the works of Rudy Anaya and imagining the adventuresome walk of Paul Salopek, also by coincidence a New Mexican, and what good company I've kept. Both have stepped far beyond their comfort zones to find our human commonality. This combination of intellectual companions has been an odd pairing of muses, but together they've influenced how I think about the American West as both my physical and intellectual home. Our claims to this home are just that, they're claims, and should not be dependent on our migratory status. Some of us were here before others, and we have a right to have our home undisturbed by these newcomers. But we also have an obligation to incorporate newcomers by expanding our sense of community and neighborhood. Like Antonio in Bless Me Ultima, we need to find the balance between home and wandering. Now, while Anaya missed the mark in thinking that the Chinese were the same little raza as his Chicano brethren, he did understand the unifying power of symbols to help us see one another. Towards the end of Bless Me Ultima, Antonio speaks with his father about the influence of Ultima on them as they each seek their own place in a complex world that was opening up to them. Antonio's father tells him, quote, understanding comes with life. As a man grows, he sees life and he sees death. He is happy and sad. He works, plays, meets people. Sometimes it takes a lifetime to acquire understanding, because in the end, understanding simply means having a sympathy for people. Ultima had a sympathy for people, and is so complete that with it she can touch their souls and cure them. So I return to the question with which I began this talk. Am I Chinese? No, of course not. I'm not Chinese in the way that Anaya imagined in terms of having a common set of cultural understandings with another group of brown people who are united by some genetic or cultural ties in a struggle against imperialism and racism. And I'm not Chinese in the way that my genetics and paleontological past suggest. Those ancestors arrived in North America some 15,000 years ago, and the ice walls closed behind them, leaving them cut off from their ancestors and their society. I have no cultural baggage left from those migrations. And yet I feel an affinity with Chinese people and culture, as I've made my home among them these past 5 years. And while I'm not Chinese, we are all human. I and my ancestors historically share the common experiences of constantly searching for home and the struggle to make a living on a harsh landscape. And in particular, I've been thinking about the ways that all humans struggle to control water, what value we place on it as a commodity, as a symbol, and as a necessity of life. I see the parallels in the way our communities revere the power of water and the way our national governments seek to control its worth and power through massive infrastructure projects. I've come to realize over the last few years that in the West, we're all migrants. We have all come from someplace else, even if it was thousands upon thousands of years ago. The American West has always been the ending point of people's journeys to find a home. And whether it was migrants crossing Beringia into the Americas, or white settlers heading west across the Oregon Trail, or families moving north across La Frontera, or Asian immigrants heading east to build the railroads, all of these people were willing to leave their own homes and venture forth across vast distances to make new homes in a foreign land. Travel, living in foreign countries, and relationships with those who are outside of our family and communities can and should lead us to a more open understanding of not only the new world we have explored, but also provide us insight into the places we call home. In this story of the American West is the final meeting place for travelers ending migrations that have lasted millennia. The West is not a borderland. It's not a frontier, but it is the place of humanity's reunion. It is the home for the last wanderers of the human race.